We are in Porto today to talk about the metro, which is actually a light rail, but who's keeping track?
The system has been a huge success in many ways, finally giving residents a way to get around traffic and significantly improving certain public spaces.
If you have no metro, you will have a much worse quality of life.
But it almost didn't happen.
It was highly criticized.
Porto had to overcome some incredibly tough topography, all while building something that would work for both suburbs and a city center that is literally a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
And that wasn't even the hardest challenge, because the metro was involved in what might have been the worst financial decision ever made by any transit agency. The story of the metro shows us that there are no excuses for not improving transit. And in this video, we'll see why other cities should pay attention, and why money isn't always everything. To understand why Porto even needed a metro in the first place, we have to go back in time.
The Porto metropolitan area is Portugal's second largest, home to 1.7 million people. Today, it's an extremely popular tourism destination, specifically the city of Porto itself. But the whole area is still a major manufacturing and industrial hub, even with some decline in the past few decades. And we'll start our journey in the 12th century. That was around when some iconic landmarks in the city were being constructed, like the Porto Cathedral and the defensive walls. These features shaped development patterns within the core, creating a fabric of narrow, winding streets that millions of tourists now go to see, like me. But as the centuries passed, this tight layout wasn't all that great for economic growth, so Porto attempted to modernize the city.
They built wider avenues like Rua do Amada in the 18th century, which are still tiny by today's standards.
Then the 20th century brought massive ring road motorways like the VCI, and the traffic problems really began. These motorways fueled booming suburbanization, with the population of the 5 municipalities adjacent to Porto growing over 50% between 1960 and 1980, while the city of Porto itself only grew by around 8%. At the same time, the growth of tourism and the decline of traditional industries like textiles meant that employment in the region was increasingly concentrated in the service sector and in the core.
When you look at the services, Porto is still the directional center of all this area. That's for sure.
So every day, a huge number of people traveled radially between the suburbs and the city. And most of these people were forced to drive because the transit wasn't great.
Porto did have an iconic tram system, but that was phased out in the 60s and 70s in favor of buses for very valid cost reasons.
And in a story that played out all over the world, these buses got stuck in traffic as car usage increased, making them less reliable and pushing more people to drive.
Bus wankers!
The result was that every day, a huge number of cars flooded off the motorways and into Porto's city center, bringing the whole thing to a halt.
When, for instance, people take a long time to go to work, a lot of money is lost indirectly because these people in traffic jams.
This is Professor Manuel Vilares. He co-wrote this book about the metro along with Professor Pinho, and I went to the Nova University in Lisbon to meet with him.
You're always with young people, and this is very important to keep young.
Their research is a huge part of this video, so we'll be hearing a lot from both of them. Now back to Porto's traffic.
This was clearly bad for people, the economy, and the environment. So in 1989, the STCP started looking at solutions.
And to the surprise of nobody, they chose light rail. I know there's ambiguity about this term, so I specifically mean a semi-metro, which typically runs tram cars through tunnels or other separated alignments through city centers, before coming up on the surface away from the core. And I gather that Porto did this for 3 main reasons. First, semi-metros are flexible, which saves money.
It's a typical medieval city that we wanted to preserve.
It can be tunneled where necessary, such as underneath the narrow streets in Porto's historic core, but otherwise use cheaper surface alignments in suburbs where there's more space. This cost saving was very important, because Portugal had only joined the EU in 1986, and at that point had a GDP per capita that was only 60% of the Union average. Any money that was saved, for example by not building a fully underground subway, meant that the metro could extend further away from the city to better capture that radial car traffic. Second, light rail can genuinely improve urban areas. It can motivate the redesign of wide arterial roads into green, walkable boulevards with new public spaces, especially with new low-floor vehicles that were gaining popularity around that time.
This improved very much the quality of life because where metro stations were done, usually they plant a lot of trees, so the city is much more beautiful.
But I think the biggest reason for using light rail was that everyone else was doing the same thing. France made it cool to revive old tram systems in places like Strasbourg, Grenoble, and basically any city that felt like it. Countries like Germany were upgrading their trams by giving them rapid transit segments like tunnels through dense areas, creating Stadtbahn networks that eventually became the semi-metro concept elsewhere.
So it wasn't like light rail was the only choice here, but it did make a lot of sense.
And once that decision was made, Porto went all in. The initial plan called for a semi-metro system with 4 lines, running underground across the city center, then coming up on the surface away from the core.
There was a metropolitan view that was basically a north-south line and an east-west line.
It would cost 1.3 billion euros, and we'll look very closely at this funding later on in the video.
Construction broke ground in May 1999, only around a decade after the idea was first floated. So, all things considered, not too bad.
But just because the light rail concept worked on paper, didn't mean that it was easy to build. Porto sits on these steep hills made of granite that are over 100 meters high, or 16 Ford F-150s. We already know that steep slopes don't mix well with most modes of transport, but that granite was actually a big problem.
It's not an homogeneous granite, so it's from a geotechnical point of view, it's a quite complicated area.
The most tragic manifestation of this came in 2001. Part of a tunnel collapsed during construction, taking down a house above it and killing 1 occupant inside.
Where the first phase of the project was built was a particularly difficult area.
But the clearest symbol of these preservation and geographic challenges was undoubtedly the revitalization of the Dom Luis Bridge. Built in 1886, the bridge connects Porto with Gaia, the city south of the Douro River. It carried cars, pedestrians, trams, and buses at various points in history, but by the 1990s it had become choked with vehicle traffic. As it turned out, the MDP also determined that this bridge would be the best way for a new metro to cross the Douro River, since it already connected the central areas of both Porto and Gaia. Building a new bridge in this area would also be astronomically expensive and disruptive, so that was never really a viable option.
Adapting the Dom to carry new 40-ton train cars would require a huge modernization effort, and not just to add electrical cables to the bridge deck, for example, but to redesign the entire flow of vehicle traffic around the area. A big challenge for sure, but Porto did it anyway.
11.6 million euros were poured into revitalizing the bridge, which involved replacing over 60% of the iron on the upper deck. The new version removed road traffic entirely from that upper deck. Only the metro and pedestrians would cross up top, creating an incredible walkable connection between Porto and Gaia that's probably one of the city's defining features today. Private cars were eventually banned from the bridge altogether, although Porto did spend 14 million euros to build the nearby Infante Bridge to relieve some of that car traffic.
This is a preservation masterclass. It's also a refreshing contrast to when decision makers say it's too risky or difficult to do something like reactivate an old train line, for example. This redevelopment added a lot to Porto, just like this hoodie can add a lot to your life this winter. We're actually a bit out of order here, because the bridge rehab was done in 2005, but the first part of the metro actually opened in 2002.
But I think the specific order of events matters less than the outcome, because by 2006, Porto had pulled off that ambitious initial network, and people loved it. Or at least, loved it enough to use it. Ridership more than doubled from the year prior, and the system continues to set records year after year, with 79 million trips in 2023.
I think it's remarkable, actually.
A particularly heartening finding was that the metro's typical rider was a single middle-class woman under the age of 24. I know that's straight from MDP's own surveys, which is fraught with selection bias, but a good sign nonetheless for system safety. And on any weekday, especially after work, it's absolutely packed. It actually raises some questions around capacity and route planning that we'll look at later on in the video. To better illustrate all of this, I asked Charlie, one of you amazing subscribers who had relatives in Porto that were regular users of the metro. One of them studied at Porto and said that you could expect the metro to come within 10 minutes, and that it was definitely better than Lisbon's. Another who grew up and worked in the area agreed that you can reliably get to anywhere you needed, and not once was he late for work. He also said that the metro helped mend a large disconnect between both sides of the river, giving people living on the south side, like himself, access to more opportunities in the north. As a side note, I always want to involve you guys in these videos, and it's way easier for me to keep track of everyone if you fill in that Google form I've been linking, or just shoot me an email. And follow me on Instagram, because there'll be some new content coming there in 2025, and I feel like it's easier for me to communicate with you guys on there as well. At this point, it might seem like the metro is a perfect success story, but it had one key weakness: political influence.
That metropolitan area is run by a junta.
Decisions that affected multiple municipalities, like where a new metro should go, were undoubtedly influenced by this junta, which was made up of the 17 mayors within the Porto metropolitan area.
There's here a kind of a conflict of interest. You are supposed to look at the interests of all the metropolitan area, but at the same time, you know that you have been elected by the people that lives in that particular municipality where you belong.
Each mayor naturally wanted the metro to extend into their own municipality, resulting in the metro arguably limiting its own effectiveness by serving what these mayors wanted, instead of the corridors that actually had the highest demand. This is especially true for Gaia, which has the largest population out of all the neighboring municipalities, but only a single metro line, at least until the Ruby line opens later this decade. It was a similar situation in Gondomar. The area is home to plenty of Porto-bound commuters, but only received a metro connection in 2011. As a result, the metro actually hasn't been that useful at reducing car usage.
I have to say that the most important immediate impact was to capture passengers from the bus system.
This wasn't exactly unexpected, since the metro was intended to consolidate and replace unreliable bus service. But one decade later, researchers found that in areas directly served by the metro, the rate of growth in the number of car trips slowed, but the absolute number of trips didn't decrease. It was even worse in areas not directly served by the metro, where growth in car trips largely continued unaffected. So yeah, definitely not ideal. But we'll see at the end of the video how the MDP and Professor Pinho are addressing these issues with new extensions like the Ruby line.
If you watch my videos with any regularity, you might have noticed that there's something completely missing from this video so far. That's right, project financing.
The original 1.3 billion euro budget was intended to be around 42% funded by various public sources, including EU Cohesion Fund money intended to help countries with less money improve their infrastructure. But around 2003, as parts of the metro slowly came online, the MDP approved several extensions to the system, such as the airport line. This pushed the total budget from 1.3 billion to a bit over 2 billion euros. This expansion was by and large a good thing, greatly increasing the utility of the system. But the amount of subsidies didn't increase along with the budget. So instead of 42%, subsidies eventually only made up around 24% of funding. And take a guess as to how that funding gap was filled.
It was funded mainly with loans.
The MDP mostly paid for a larger system with debt. Carrying debt means that you have to pay interest, and that interest soon became a real drag on the MDP's overall finances.
The problem is, at that time, the interest rate was very high. So you had to get loans to pay the operation and to pay the loans. Loans to pay loans. And the debt was increased very fast.
The MDP was under strong pressure to do something. So in 2007, they rolled up to Santander Bank and entered into what some news outlets called the worst trade of all time.
It's the name of the worst trade of all time. But I think it's a little unfair to say this.
In a nutshell, Santander agreed to reduce MDP's rates from 4.76% to 1.76%, as long as the 3-month Euribor rate stayed between 2 and 6%. If the Euribor left that 2 to 6% range, then the MDP would have to pay Santander some extra money, calculated as follows. 2 times the difference between the actual rate and the closest threshold, so if the Euribor was 1%, then MDP would have to pay 2%, in addition to the previous payment. You don't have to be very good at math to realize that this can easily end up with the MDP paying over 100% interest rates.
I agree that this swap was not fair, clear.
Because when the financial crisis hit in 2009, the Euribor suddenly dropped to around 0.5%. For every quarter that the Euribor sat below 2%, MDP was tacking on more and more debt, eventually reaching rates over 40%.
I think one of the reasons why they called for the swap was because of the need of liquidity. But when you are in need, you have more difficulties on negotiate.
This debt snowball ended up in UK courts, and both sides agreed in 2017 to restructure the loan under new terms that weren't as, dare I say, stupid. This whole debacle clearly didn't help MDP's finances, and they continued to stagger along until 2023, when the Portuguese state stepped in and began a 99.9% debt equity swap, essentially a buyout that would erase the MDP's entire debt load.
And this is very important, because if you have a very important debt in any company, you have always losses, and the losses are very high. Even if you can do a lot of savings in operational costs, but doesn't help anything. So you are not even motivated to that. You are focused only on how to pay the debt every day.
By wiping the slate clean, the MDP has a real chance to right some wrongs. This metro system has gone through the spin cycle, but I'm still really impressed that it even got built in the first place. What's even more impressive is that when considering the wider economic, social, and environmental benefits, Vilares and Pinho found that the MDP returned over 9 times its initial €2 billion investment. It's clearly been profitable from this holistic standpoint. The tricky thing, and this goes for every transit system in the world pretty much, is that none of these externalities can be captured by the operating agency as revenue.
If there are positive externalities, you have to measure in a very accurate way, but then these externalities should be compensated. Otherwise, the other alternative is to make the user pay this. But if you do this, the demand reduces and the externalities become much smaller.
I explained this idea of subsidizing transit and allocative efficiency in one of my videos way back. Looking forward, the network is currently being expanded with the Rose and Ruby lines, helping relieve capacity issues and addressing some of those route deficiencies we discussed earlier. And Professor Pinho is doing all he can to make sure that these new routes are backed by data.
We had to transmit that to local politicians that in some cases, some proposals would make sense, but in some other cases, similar proposals won't make any sense at all. It would be a disaster.
My central takeaway from the Metro's entire story is that Porto just got it done. The routes weren't perfect, the train cars are honestly pretty space inefficient, and their finances blew up in spectacular fashion.
But just take a look at the areas it's transformed, the amount of cars it's taken off the streets, and the sheer number of people that use this thing every single day. It's pretty hard to call it anything but a success.
I don't think it is possible for a new generation to conceive the city of Porto without a metro system. So, that's it.